I always thought I was careful in the woods. I had been hiking for years since I was a teenager, and I never took dumb risks. I checked the weather, packed more food than I needed, carried extra water, a good knife, and a basic first aid kit. I never pushed myself past my limits, and I always stuck to the marked trails. That last part was important. People who wandered off trail were the ones who got lost, injured, or worse. I didn't want to be one of those people. But sometimes all it takes is one small mistake. This trip was supposed to be simple. Just 2 days alone in the mountains, a solo getaway to clear my head. I had picked a trail in a national forest, a 12-mile loop that climbed up through thick pine forest before opening up into alpine meadows, with a campsite near a lake at the highest point. The plan was to hike in, camp for a night, then take the loop back down the next morning. Nothing crazy. I set out early in the morning, my pack snug against my back, my boots solid on the dirt path. The first few miles were peaceful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I fell into a rhythm, my boots crunching against the packed dirt, my breathing steady. It was around mile 5 when I saw the side trail. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't marked. Just a thin path, barely wide enough for a single person, breaking off from the main trail and winding into the trees. It looked well-trodden, too clear to be an animal trail, but not maintained like the official paths. I stopped, frowning at it. I should have kept walking. Instead, I pulled out my map, double-checking the area. Nothing. No official trails, no old logging roads, just solid forest. But the trail was there, and it looked recent, like people had been using it. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who went off trail, but something about it bothered me. If it was an unofficial path, where did it go? A shortcut? A dead end? My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow path. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The deeper I walked, the more the sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. No wind, no birds, just my footsteps. The path itself twisted through the trees, curving unnaturally, like it was made to disorient someone. I kept going, my stomach tightening for no good reason. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I should have turned around, but I didn't. That was my second mistake. The trail sloped downward, the trees growing closer together, the branches hanging low. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air smelled different, like damp rot. The dirt beneath my boots turned soft, almost muddy. My instincts screamed at me to go back, but I had that hiker's stubbornness. I had already come this far. Might as well see where it led. Then I found the cabin. It was old, too old. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging, the door hanging open just a little. No signs of recent activity, no footprints, no tire tracks, no fire pit. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. Something was wrong with it. I could feel it. I don't know why I stepped closer. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone had been there recently. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. The air felt thick, humid. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in my ears. The door creaked when I pushed it. Inside, it was worse. The first thing I saw was the chair. Just a single wooden chair, sitting in the center of the room. Nothing else, no furniture, no bed, no stove. Just that chair. And the walls. The walls had scratches on them. Hundreds of them. Deep, uneven gouges, like someone had raked their fingernails across the wood over and over. Some marks were old, faded with time. Others looked fresh. Something moved behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. But there was nothing there. Just the trees outside, swaying slightly. The light was dim, like the sun had suddenly dipped lower in the sky. I needed to leave. Now, I backed out of the cabin, my pulse hammering. I turned, ready to follow the path back to the main trail. But it wasn't there. The trail was gone. I spun in circles, searching for it. I had just walked in from that direction. There should have been a clear path. But all I saw were trees. Thick, dark trees, pressing closer than before. My breath came in quick, uneven gasps. I wasn't stupid. I knew panic would make things worse. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had a compass. I had my map. I could get back to the main trail if I stayed calm. I turned west, the direction I had come from. I pushed through the trees, branches scraping against my arms, my legs. I walked for 10 minutes, then 20. Then I saw the cabin again. I stopped dead. My brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I had walked away from it. I had been going in a straight line. And yet there it was. The same sagging roof, the same open door, the same chair, sitting in the middle of the room. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged. I tripped, hit the ground hard, scrambled up, kept going. Then suddenly the trees thinned. I stumbled onto solid ground. The real trail, the marked, official trail. I stood there, gasping, looking around. The sun was higher than before, the air cooler, normal, the way it should be. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I hiked out of there, faster than I ever had in my life, barely stopping until I reached my car. I never found that trail again. I checked maps, asked other hikers. No one knew about it. No one had ever seen an old cabin in those woods. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stayed any longer, I wouldn't have made it back. I was looking for solitude. That was my only goal. No distractions, no stress. Just a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods. I had found the place through a rental site, though there weren't many details. The owner barely wrote a description. Quiet off-grid cabin, perfect for a getaway. No neighbors, 10 miles from town. That was all I needed to hear. It was cheap too. Way too cheap for a full week, which should have been my first warning sign. But I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted peace and quiet. I should have done more research. The first half of the trip was fine. Smooth roads, gas stations, small towns. But once I turned onto the unmarked dirt road, things changed. The forest got thicker, pressing in from both sides. The road itself became narrow and uneven, full of deep ruts and potholes. I had to drive slowly, steering carefully to avoid getting stuck. I didn't see a single house or car for over an hour. No power lines, no mailboxes, just trees stretching endlessly in all directions. A small, uneasy feeling settled in my gut. This place was really, really far from everything. Eventually, the road ended in a small clearing. The cabin was simple and weathered, a single-story wooden structure with a metal roof. A small porch wrapped around the front, and a rusty old generator sat beside the steps. There was no driveway, just grass and dirt. I parked my truck, grabbed my bags, and stepped out. The air was thick and quiet. No birds, no wind, just absolute silence. I walked up to the cabin, the wood creaking loudly under my boots. That's when I noticed it. The front door was already open. Not wide open, just slightly ajar, like someone had left in a hurry. A small chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was nothing. The wind, a faulty latch, but the door wasn't swinging or moving. It was just sitting there, cracked open, like someone was waiting inside. I hesitated for a long moment. Then, I pushed the door open and stepped in. The inside was bare bones. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a wooden table, and a single chair. A twin-sized bed in the corner with old, musty blankets. A fireplace with a few logs stacked beside it. And a single window facing the woods. It looked normal, but something felt wrong. I couldn't place it at first. Then I realized the dust. Everything was coated in a thin layer of undisturbed dust. The bed, the table, the floor. No footprints, no handprints, It was like no one had set foot in here for years. So why had the door been open? I swallowed the discomfort and forced myself to move. I needed to get the generator going before dark. The generator rumbled outside, giving me just enough power for a single dim light bulb and the mini fridge. I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat at the small table, eating a sandwich from my cooler. The silence outside was oppressive. No wind, no animals, just the steady hum of the generator. I tried to read, but my mind kept drifting back to the door. Something about it felt wrong. Why had it been open? Had someone been here before me? Had they left in a hurry? Or worse, were they still here? The thought made my stomach tighten. I checked the bedroom closet. Empty. I checked under the bed. Nothing. I checked the bathroom behind the shower curtain. Clear. It was just me and the silence. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Eventually, I climbed into bed, shut my eyes, and tried to sleep. I woke up to a sound. A soft, deliberate crunching outside the cabin. Footsteps. My body went completely still. The generator's hum masked most noises, but I could still hear them. Slow, careful steps moving through the grass and dirt just beyond the porch. Someone was walking around the cabin, circling it. I stayed perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, but deep down I knew better. This was human movement, deliberate, slow, calculated. I lay in bed for what felt like an eternity, listening to the soft crunch of footsteps outside. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. I waited. Silence. Then the doorknob rattled. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The doorknob twisted again, but the lock held. Then silence. For hours I lay awake, listening, waiting. When the first light of dawn finally came, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my knife, pulled on my boots, and stepped onto the porch. The ground was soft and damp from the night. If someone had been out here, there should have been footprints. But there were none. Nothing. Like no one had been there at all. But I knew what I had heard. I scanned the tree line, my skin crawling. That's when I saw him. A man deep in the woods, just standing there, barely visible between the trees. Not moving, not blinking, just watching me. My breath caught, my body locked up. He was too far away for me to see his face, but I knew he was looking right at me. A bolt of pure fear shot through me. I took a step back, and just like that, he was gone. I packed immediately, shoved everything into my truck, yanked the keys from the generator, and started the engine. The moment I got onto the dirt road, I felt like I was being watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see that man standing in the road behind me, but there was nothing. It took me almost 2 hours to reach the main road, and only when I hit pavement did I finally let myself breathe. I pulled into a gas station near town, hands shaking as I grabbed my phone to call the rental owner. I needed answers, but when I pulled up the listing, it was gone, like it had never existed at all. I don't know who that man in the woods was. I don't know how he moved so silently. I don't know why the cabin was unlocked, or why there were no footprints when I heard someone walking outside. But I do know one thing. That cabin wasn't meant to be rented out. And whoever had been watching me, they never wanted me to leave. I had been camping solo for years, ever since I was in my early 20s. Something about being out in the wilderness, away from the constant hum of civilization, made me feel grounded. It wasn't about adventure or pushing my limits. I just liked the quiet, the long stretches of silence, the smell of pine and damp earth, the distant sound of running water from a stream or lake. That year, I decided to camp out in a remote part of Montana. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I found on a topographic map. A clearing by a lake, miles away from the nearest road, nestled between rolling hills and thick forest. It looked perfect. No tourists, no RVs, no campfire smoke from families roasting marshmallows. Just me, my tent, and the wild. The drive took most of the day. I parked my truck on the side of an old service road, unloaded my gear, and started hiking in. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like an old animal path that had been reclaimed by the forest. I had my GPS, a compass, and a paper map, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I'd done this plenty of times before. By late afternoon, I reached the spot. It was even better than I expected. A flat patch of ground near the lake, shaded by tall pines. The water was calm, barely rippling, reflecting the pale blue sky above. No signs of other campers, no trash, no broken branches from someone setting up before me. It felt untouched. I set up camp the way I always did, tent first, then the fire pit. I collected some dry wood, stacked it neatly, and made sure I had enough for the night. Once that was done, I sat by the lake and ate a quick dinner. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air cooled the way it does in the mountains, and I pulled on a jacket. As the light faded, I started a small fire. I wasn't the type to sit around it telling stories or getting lost in thought. I just liked the warmth, the way it kept the night from creeping in too close. The forest was quiet, aside from the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Normal sounds, squirrels, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Nothing that put me on edge. But as I sat there, something started to nag at me. The feeling, the kind you can't explain. The kind that settles in your gut and makes your skin prickle, like being watched. I'd had it before on other trips, but it always passed. Usually it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness, the way the trees seemed to press in when you were alone. I shook it off and focused on the fire. It wasn't like I was in bear country, at least not heavily. I'd taken precautions, kept my food sealed tight, and hung anything with a scent far from my tent. If anything was out there, it wasn't after me. The feeling didn't go away, though. At some point, I heard something, a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, not far off, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the woods. I looked up, firelight flickering against the trees. Could have been anything. A raccoon, a fox, even a bird landing on a dead limb. But then there was another snap, closer this time. I stood up, scanning the dark. My flashlight was in the tent, but I didn't want to go fumbling for it. Instead, I grabbed a stick from the fire and lifted it, letting the glow stretch further into the trees. The underbrush was thick, shadows shifting with the light. Nothing moved. I waited, listening, my ears strained against the quiet, but the forest had gone still. Not even the insects were making noise anymore. After a minute, I lowered the stick and tossed it back into the fire. I told myself it was just an animal passing through, probably spooked by the fire, stopping to watch me the way animals sometimes do. Still, the feeling lingered. I let the fire burn down to embers before climbing into my tent. Zipped up the flap, laid down, and listened. The silence was heavy, but I forced myself to relax. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to something outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just the faintest sound of movement. A shuffling, slow, deliberate, right outside. I didn't move. My first thought was a bear. But bears don't move like that. They don't creep. They don't hesitate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it at the tent wall. A shadow moved, not an animal shape. Person. I shot up, heart hammering. I wasn't armed, not with a gun anyway, just a knife in my pack. My mind raced through options. Make noise? Stay quiet? Then the zipper moved. Not fast. Slow. Testing. I lunged forward and slapped my hand against it, shoving it back down. My pulse was a drum in my ears. Silence. Then footsteps. Walking away. Slow, unhurried. I waited until they faded completely. Then I unzipped the tent, just enough to peek out. The fire was still smoldering, casting a dull glow. The trees stood silent. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed up. Fast. Didn't bother with breakfast, didn't take my time. My hands were shaking as I shoved everything into my pack. As I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something. Footprints, not boots, bare feet, leading from the treeline, stopping right at my tent, then turning back. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. I hiked out faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. Didn't look back until I was on the road, miles away. I never reported it. What would I even say? But I never camped alone again. I needed a break, a real break, not just a long weekend, not just turning off my phone for a day, but something longer, something quiet. I had spent the last 5 years drowning in stress. Work, bills, the endless noise of city life. It had been weighing on me for too long, and I needed to step away from it all. That's why I rented the cabin. A week of complete solitude, buried deep in the woods, miles away from anyone. It was perfect. At least that's what I thought at first. The directions were straightforward at first. Highway for a while, then a long, winding country road that led deeper into the forest. The further I went, the more the road turned into hard-packed dirt with deep ruts from old truck tires. After nearly an hour of slow, bumpy driving, I spotted the turnoff, a barely noticeable path leading into the trees. I almost missed it. The cabin's owner had warned me about the road, saying it could get rough after rain, and he wasn't lying. The truck bounced over the uneven ground, branches scraped against the sides, and I had to slow down even more to avoid bottoming out. By the time I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees. It was small and old, exactly what I had expected from the pictures. A single-story wooden structure, a slanted metal roof, and a wraparound porch. The windows had thick wooden shutters, and a pile of firewood was neatly stacked against the side. A handmade sign near the porch read, "Black Hollow Cabin." I stepped out of the truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath of the crisp forest air. No cars, no city noise, no people, just the sound of wind moving through the trees. Felt good. I grabbed my bag and headed to the porch. That's when I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly open. I stopped. The owner had told me the key would be under a loose board on the porch. He hadn't mentioned leaving the door open. I hesitated, staring at the dark gap between the door and the frame. Something about it bothered me, but I shook it off. Maybe he had forgotten to latch it properly after cleaning. I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the cabin was exactly as described, simple but clean. A wood-burning stove, a small couch, a tiny kitchen, and a hallway leading to a single bedroom and bathroom. Everything looked untouched. No signs of anyone breaking in. No footprints in the dust. Still, I felt uneasy. I double-checked the windows and back door. All locked. I decided not to think about it too much. Maybe it had just blown open. I shut the door, locked it, and told myself everything was fine. That was my first mistake. I didn't sleep well. I woke up several times, feeling like I had heard something outside. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind. But at some point in the middle of the night, I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic creaking, like wood bending under weight. The sound of footsteps on the porch. I held my breath. The noise was slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I stayed completely still, listening. Then silence. I didn't hear footsteps retreating. Didn't hear branches snapping or leaves rustling. Just silence. It was as if whoever or whatever had been outside was still standing there. I lay in bed for what felt like hours, gripping the handle of the hunting knife I had brought with me. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up late the next morning. Sunlight was streaming through the shutters, and for a brief moment, I almost convinced myself I had imagined the sounds. Then I stepped onto the porch and saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't boot prints. They were bare feet. The prints started at the tree line, led onto the porch, then stopped right in front of the door. No prints leading away. A cold feeling crawled up my spine. I scanned the trees, heart pounding. Nothing. The forest was still and quiet. I told myself it had to be a drifter or a hiker, maybe some weirdo living off the grid who got curious about the cabin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me while I slept. I decided to cut the trip short. I had planned for a week. But now, one more night, then I was out of there. I locked every door and window, made sure the shutters were closed tight. I sat in front of the fireplace, gun within arm's reach, listening. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, breathing, right outside the cabin. Slow, deep, like someone was standing just beyond the wall, listening. I gripped the gun. Then, a long, slow scratch against the wooden shutters. Not an animal, not the wind, something deliberate. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The scratching continued, slow and rhythmic. Then silence. The breathing was gone. I sat awake the rest of the night, heart pounding. At dawn, I packed my bags. I wasn't sticking around to see what would happen next. I stepped outside, gun in hand, scanning the tree line. The footprints were gone. No sign of anything, as if whatever had been out there had never existed at all. I didn't question it. I threw my bags into the truck, turned the key, and drove out of there as fast as the road would let me. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, miles away from the cabin. I called the owner once I had service again, told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed. "You weren't the first to say that," he finally said. I didn't ask any more questions, and I never went back. Hiking had always been something I did to clear my head. I wasn't reckless, but I enjoyed pushing myself, going deep into the wilderness, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the appeal, the quiet, the solitude. This trip was supposed to be just another one of those. A 3-day solo hike through a remote canyon in the desert. No marked trails, no crowds, just me and the open landscape. I had planned every detail. I had studied the maps, packed extra water, brought my GPS and a paper map as backup. I wasn't expecting to get lost. I wasn't expecting to find something that shouldn't have been there. Day 1, I parked at the trailhead early in the morning, stepping out into the cool desert air. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. I strapped on my pack, adjusted my gear, and set out. The first few miles were easy, the ground mostly flat, dotted with low shrubs and dry riverbeds. The canyon walls rose in the distance, towering cliffs of red rock, cut deep by centuries of wind and water. That was my destination. By midday, I had descended into the canyon. The air was hotter down there, the walls rising high on either side, blocking most of the wind. It was quiet, the only sounds my own footsteps and the occasional bird echoing off the rock. I followed a dry stream bed, navigating around boulders and patches of loose sand. The plan was to hike deep into the canyon, find a good place to camp, and then explore some of the side passages the next day. Everything was going as planned, until I found the footprints. They were faint, half covered by sand, but they were there, barefoot, and they weren't human. The shape was wrong, long, too narrow, the toes splayed in a strange way. I crouched down, running my fingers over the edges. Fresh. Within the last day or two, I glanced up, scanning the canyon around me. Nothing, just rock and silence. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had found a decent spot to camp. Flat ground, some natural cover from the wind. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat with my back against a boulder, watching the light fade. The silence felt different now, heavier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside my tent, a shifting of sand, a soft, deliberate movement. But every time I listened, there was nothing, just silence. Day 2, I woke up early, feeling uneasy but determined to finish what I had planned. I left most of my gear at camp and set out to explore one of the side canyons. It was narrower than the main path, winding through high walls of rock, the sky barely visible overhead. An hour in, I found something strange. A structure. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw it wasn't natural. A rough shelter built against the canyon wall. Small, maybe 5 feet tall, made from stacked stones and dried mud. It didn't look old. Someone had built this recently. I stepped closer, my pulse picking up. The entrance was low, just a dark opening in the rock. I hesitated. Then I noticed something near the entrance. Pile of bones, picked clean, sun-bleached. Some were animal, small skulls, ribs, but some were bigger, too big. I turned and left, moving fast. I didn't run, not yet, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached camp, the sun was sinking. I packed my things, my hands moving quickly. I wasn't staying another night. I started hiking back, pushing myself hard. I could make it to the canyon entrance by morning. Then I heard it, a sound behind me, soft, footsteps in the sand. I didn't turn around. I kept moving, faster. The sound kept pace. Then I smelled it. Rot, thick and sour. I walked faster, my breath coming short. My heart was hammering. Then up ahead something moved. A shape stepping out from behind a boulder. Tall, thin, watching. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't stop. Not when I tripped. Not when my legs burned. Not when the canyon walls seemed to press in around me. I ran until the sun rose. Until I saw my truck in the distance. Until I was safe. I don't know what I saw in that canyon. I don't ever want to find out. I wanted to be alone. That was the plan. No people, no phones, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and some quiet time to clear my head. I'd rented an old hunting cabin about 30 miles from the nearest town. Isolated. No neighbors, no main roads, no cell signal. It sounded perfect when I booked it, but I didn't realize how much I'd regret it. I drove up in the afternoon, following a winding dirt road deep into the forest. The farther I went, the rougher the path got. Potholes, loose gravel, tree branches stretching over the road like twisted fingers. Eventually, the cabin came into view. A small, one-story structure with a sagging porch and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was no driveway, just a patch of flattened grass where previous renters had parked. I pulled in, cut the engine, and stepped out. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that makes you feel like something is listening. The forest pressed in on all sides, the trees thick and dark. There was no wind, no birds, nothing. I shook it off. I was being paranoid. The cabin was old, but it looked solid. Dark wooden walls, a tin roof, a single window with heavy shutters. I checked my phone, no signal. Good. That was what I wanted. I grabbed my bag and stepped onto the porch. The wooden planks creaked under my boots. The door was unlocked. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The listing said the owner would leave the key under a loose board, but the door wasn't even shut properly. It was slightly open, just enough for a crack of darkness to peek through. I hesitated. Maybe the owner had left it open for me, or maybe the last renter forgot to lock it. Still, it gave me a bad feeling. Inside, the air was musty and stale, like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. The main room had a fireplace, a wooden rocking chair, and a small table. The kitchen was just a counter with an old sink, a gas stove, and a rusty fridge that hummed loudly. The bedroom was even smaller, just a single bed and a nightstand. I checked every corner. No signs of anyone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside recently. I told myself I was imagining it. Then I saw the footprints. I slept horribly. Every sound woke me up. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, something moving in the distance. By morning, I was exhausted. I stepped outside to get some fresh air. That's when I saw them. Footprints. In the dirt. Leading from the woods to the cabin. Not mine. Barefoot. Too large for an animal. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I checked around the cabin. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. But someone had been out there. Watching. I tried to brush it off. Maybe a hunter had passed through. Maybe it was just my imagination. But I locked the door behind me anyway. I forced myself to go about my day as if nothing was wrong. I chopped some wood, read a book, tried to enjoy the quiet. But as the sun dipped behind the trees, the unease crept back. I sat by the fireplace, trying to ignore the feeling that someone was out there. And then, late into the night, I heard it. A soft thud, then another, like footsteps, moving slowly around the cabin. My heart pounded. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a soft scratching sound. Near the window, I gripped the hatchet I had left by the fireplace. I didn't breathe, didn't move. Then a long, slow breath, right outside the door. I stayed awake until dawn. Morning came. I barely slept. I decided to check the area, see if I could find any tracks. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. A small wooden shed near the tree line. I hadn't thought to check it earlier. The door was slightly open. Inside, there were old tools, rope, and a pile of clothes. Men's jeans, a flannel shirt, torn, dirty. A half-eaten can of beans sat in the corner. Fresh. Someone had been living here. Maybe they still were. I backed out and hurried to the cabin. I needed to leave, but my truck wouldn't start. I locked myself in, bolted the door, blocked the windows. I kept the hatchet close. The forest was silent, too silent. Then the door handle moved, slowly, testing the lock. My heart stopped. Then soft footsteps, moving around the cabin. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then a soft knock, a long pause, then more footsteps, moving away. I sat there until the sky turned gray with morning. I was done. I packed my bag, grabbed my knife, and set out on foot. I walked fast, kept my eyes on the road. For miles, nothing happened. No sounds, no movement. Then, around the bend, I saw him. A man, standing in the road, barefoot, filthy clothes, watching me. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. He just stood there, smiling. I turned and ran. Didn't stop until I saw my truck. Didn't care how, but it started this time. I tore out of there, dirt flying behind me. I didn't look back. I never went back. But sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, thinking about that man in the road, wondering if he ever found someone else's cabin, wondering if he's watching them right now. Camping had always been my thing. I wasn't one of those people who needed a fancy RV or a designated campsite with bathrooms and picnic tables. I liked real camping, the kind where you pack light, hike into the woods, and set up camp miles away from the nearest road. It was peaceful. No people, no traffic, no noise except for the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of animals in the brush. That's what I was looking for when I decided to take a solo trip into the mountains. I had done it before plenty of times. I wasn't reckless. I had the right gear, a map, a compass, and enough food to last me several days. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness, but nothing prepares you for when things go wrong. I had planned for a 3-day trip. I left my truck at a small pull-off near an old Forest Service road and started hiking in the late afternoon. The trail wasn't marked, but I had studied the terrain beforehand and knew the general direction I needed to go. My destination was a small lake, about 10 miles in, where I planned to set up camp. The hike was tough in some spots. The trail was barely visible in places, overgrown with weeds and low-hanging branches. The air was humid, and sweat dripped down my back as I climbed over fallen logs and picked my way through thick underbrush. I didn't see a single person the whole way in. That was exactly what I wanted. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was dipping low. The water was still, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. It was a perfect spot. I set my pack down, stretched out my aching legs, and got to work setting up my tent. I built a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the water, listening to the distant sounds of birds settling in for the night. I felt good, but that was the last time I would feel that way. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. For a second, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint light against the inside of my tent. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Then I heard it, a soft rustling, somewhere close. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, but something about the sound made my skin prickle. It wasn't random movement, it was slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved around my campsite, careful, like someone or something was trying not to be heard. I felt my chest tighten. My knife was in my pack, just outside the tent. My heart thumped painfully as I reached out slowly, trying to unzip the tent as quietly as possible. Then silence. I waited, ears straining, but the noise never came back. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon sniffing around my camp. Maybe a trick of the wind. I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came, and everything seemed normal again. The uneasy feeling from the night before faded in the daylight. I shook it off, made coffee, and spent the day fishing and exploring the area around the lake. But something felt off. The woods were too quiet. Normally, you hear birds, the occasional crack of branches, the chatter of squirrels. But it was like everything was holding its breath. Still, I ignored it. I told myself I was overthinking. That evening, I built a bigger fire. Something about the warmth, the light, it made me feel safer. I stayed up late, feeding the flames, watching the darkness beyond the fire's glow. I went to bed later than usual, hoping exhaustion would help me sleep through the night. Didn't. I woke up to the same sound, the same slow, careful rustling. But this time it was closer. My pulse hammered in my ears as I lay there, my body rigid. Then a snap, a twig, right outside my tent. Every hair on my body stood on end. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. My hand found the zipper of the tent. I tugged it slowly, inching it open, my breath shallow. The fire had died down to faint embers, barely lighting the campsite. I couldn't see anything, just shadows, trees, the dark shape of my pack resting against a fallen log. Then I saw it, a footprint, not mine, fresh in the dirt right near my tent. A boot print. My stomach turned to ice. I scanned the trees, my heart hammering, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. But I knew then I wasn't alone out there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my gear as fast as I could. I wanted to be gone, back to my truck, back to civilization. I kept my knife in my hand the entire time, my eyes darting to the trees, the bushes, scanning for any sign of movement. I hiked fast, too fast. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. I just needed to get out. But then, about 3 miles from my campsite, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A tree. Its bark was stripped in places, long gouges running down the trunk. And carved into the wood, deep and rough, were 3 words. Leave now. My blood ran cold. Someone had followed me, watched me, stood outside my tent at night. And now they wanted me gone. I didn't hesitate. I ran. Branches whipped against my arms. Thorns scratched my legs. But I didn't care. I didn't stop until I saw my truck, parked right where I left it. But something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. My stomach twisted as I stepped closer. The inside was a mess. My glove compartment open, papers strewn across the seats. My backpack, which I had left in the passenger seat, was unzipped, my things pulled out. Whoever had been watching me had been here too. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My tires spun in the dirt as I peeled out, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I never reported it. What would I say? That I heard something? That I found a footprint? That someone went through my truck? There was no proof, no cameras, no witnesses, just me. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone in those woods. I haven't been camping alone since. Camping had always been something I enjoyed, but I had never done it alone before. It was one of those things I had always told myself I'd get around to, but I never made it happen. Maybe I was just making excuses, or maybe I was avoiding the silence that came with being alone in the woods. Either way, when the opportunity finally came, I decided to take it. I picked a remote spot deep in a national forest, miles from the nearest road. No campsites, no trails, just a place I had marked on a map from a hike years ago. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving river, surrounded by thick trees. It seemed perfect. I packed light but made sure I had the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, plenty of water, a good knife, and a first aid kit. I also brought my old bolt-action rifle, more out of habit than necessity. I wasn't worried about animals, but having it made me feel a little safer. The drive out took most of the morning. The last stretch was on a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I reached the point where I'd have to hike in, the sun was already high. I grabbed my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trees were thick, but the air was cool, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Felt good to be away from everything, disconnected. No service, no people, just me and the woods. As I got closer to the clearing, the forest changed. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker. The air felt heavier. I had been here before, but something about it felt different this time. I reached the clearing by late afternoon. It was just as I remembered. A flat patch of earth surrounded by towering trees, the river just beyond. I set up my tent near the tree line, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal, listening to the sounds of the woods. It was peaceful. Then, just as the last bit of sunlight faded, I heard something. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice. A rustling in the trees behind me. I turned, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, but something about it felt off. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the trees. I sat there for a while, staring into the darkness, listening. Eventually, the sound stopped. I stayed up longer than I planned, keeping the fire burning, but the woods stayed silent. Finally, I crawled into my tent, zipped myself inside, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. First, I didn't know why. The tent was pitch black, the only sound my own breathing. Then I heard it again. The same rustling, closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I held my breath. Then silence. I gripped the knife I had tucked in my sleeping bag, every muscle locked in place. I listened, heart pounding. The sound didn't come back. I forced myself to stay awake for a while, but eventually, exhaustion won. By morning, the fear from the night before felt distant, almost like a dream. The clearing looked the same, the river still flowed, the air was still. Then I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They circled my tent, stopping just outside before vanishing into the woods. A cold wave washed over me. Someone had been here, watching. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had planned to stay another night. Maybe it had just been another hiker passing through. Maybe they didn't even know I was here. But why walk so close? Why stop at my tent? The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time the wind moved the branches, every time I heard the rustle of leaves, my heart jumped. I spent most of the afternoon gathering wood, trying to stay busy, but the unease never left. That night, I made sure the fire was big. I sat close to it, staring into the darkness, listening. Then, just past midnight, I saw it. A shape, barely visible between the trees. I froze, gripping my knife. It didn't move. I stared at it for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, it shifted. A step back, then another, then it was gone. I didn't sleep. I stayed in my tent, heart pounding, knife in hand, waiting. The footsteps came again, circling, stopping, a slow exhale just outside the tent. I stopped breathing, then silence. Minutes passed, maybe hours. When the first light of dawn touched the tent, I forced myself to move. I unzipped the flap, stepping out. The fire was nothing but embers. The air was cold, and the footprints were back. This time there were more of them, circling the campsite, stopping by my tent, then leading back into the woods. I packed fast, shoving everything into my bag, hands shaking. Every second I spent there felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The hike back felt longer. The woods felt darker. Every snap of a twig sent a jolt through my body. Halfway to my truck, the smell hit me, rotten, like meat left out too long. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I just kept walking. By the time I reached my truck, I was drenched in sweat. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. I started the engine. Then I looked up, and I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, still, watching. I didn't stick around. I tore out of there, the tires kicking up dirt, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on paved roads, the forest shrinking in my mirrors. I don't know who was out there, and I don't want to know, but I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again.